every day I pick up the paper and there are 3 stories, 4 stories, 5 stories, many of them scoops. And then she does appearances on CNN and other places. And she does it all as a mother of 3 while covering Washington from Brooklyn. Since I'm a friend of the family's going back 60 years, I remember a 5-year-old swinging on the wooden doors of my bookshelves, carefree and mischievous. Who would have thought that she would end up taking on the President of the United States? And that little girl rattled him. True, the seeds were planted in a home where the messiness of politics and the exhilaration of working for newspapers were the background music of daily life. But whatever she absorbed through osmosis, she developed a talent on her own, and to a prodigious level. As a reporter at the Post and the Daily News, often assigned to cover a certain self-promoting developer, at Politico, and finally at the Times, where there she was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for an investigation of Trump's ties to Russia. She now has written a book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America, that debuted a few weeks ago as #1 on the bestseller list. For the whole country, what an achievement. So interviewing her about the book is our own Alan Dodds Frank, and I could think of few people more suited to interview her than him, because he spent 4 decades working for newspapers, magazines, television, and the internet as an investigative reporter on business, and besides stories on the twisted dealings of Bernard Madoff and the Clinton Whitewater investment and the bribes paid to Billy Carter by Colonel Gaddafi, he did many of the important stories about Donald Trump's finances. So take it away, Alan and Maggie.
As I watched the speech last night, Mr. Trump is campaigning on selling honesty to the American people in 2024. How is that going to go?
So first of all, thank you for doing this. Thank you to Joe for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. I was not in Palm Beach last night. I was mercifully in Brooklyn. And one of my colleagues was, I was covering Palm Beach from Brooklyn. But there were a couple of dynamics that were interesting watching this speech. It was, the main thing he didn't talk about was his lies about the election in 2020. Which I don't think anyone should assume from that, well, we're done with that now. He's decided he's not talking about that anymore. I think he was very focused last night on making sure that he could get some live network coverage, and they were especially interested in Fox News. He scheduled the event at 9 p.m. because they thought Sean Hannity would take him live, and that, in fact, is what happened, although CNN did too, for a time, and then both cut away. So I think that he was building a speech around that. Then he presented a version of his administration that was just not factually accurate. He didn't build a wall. His description of the rising sea levels was wrong. The world wasn't absent jihadi attacks while he was president. I mean, you can go on and on and on. And he made it, he was on script for about 15 minutes, and he doesn't do very well with teleprompter addresses. And then you could see him getting bored, and he started deviating, and he could see the crowd wasn't that into it. So then he starts going off script, and they then do some callbacks. And by the end, he was talking about the investigations into him, and he had a couple of really notable lines, one of which is he said, "I'm a victim." He talked about, remember, he's doing this event at the same club that was searched by the FBI back in August for classified documents. An event where presumably his now new campaign committee is going to be paying him money for holding this event, because that's also been a consistent theme of the years. And And he then talked about his family, and he talked about his, what I thought was the strangest line of the night was he was talking about the investigations again, and he was talking about his son Eric, who has taken over a lot of the family business mechanics, and he said that he's got a PhD in subpoenas, and then said something to the effect of Al Capone didn't have as many subpoenas as that. It was. There's never been a presidential announcement like this.
It was actually, he said, the great Al Capone.
He did say the great Al Capone. You are correct. That is exactly what he said. And we should just know that today, Trump's CFO for the Trump Organization, Alan Weisselberg, is literally taking the stand in a tax fraud trial against the Trump Organization. So it was an unusual announcement. What exactly he's selling, I don't think we know yet. I think we will know over the coming months.
Did anything other than what you've already mentioned surprise you?
I was surprised at the degree to which he did not talk about election denialism. And I was surprised that he didn't the one thing that surprised me was that he didn't spread more blame to others in the Republican Party for the losses in the midterms.
Okay, but when he was scripted, when he was still on script, at least by my viewing, he proposed a really concerted attack on voting.
No question. He called for, among the two proposals that he, such as they were, suggested, one was legalizing the death penalty for drug dealers, and that's been something he's been workshopping for several months, and then calling for, and he's sort of done some of this too, but he called for an end to early voting. He said only paper ballots. And among other things, it doesn't only hurt Democrats, which is what he thinks it does, it hurts Republicans. Florida has an expansive early voting program. So this is not something that I think was particularly thought out. I think it was something aides gave him to make him feel better about, his claims about the election. But we'll see how often he repeats this.
Did you notice anything different about him following the teleprompter, at least for the first 15 minutes, from the way he did in 2016?
Well, in 2016, he literally walked down to the lower level of Trump Tower and ripped up his speech. So that was, it was different.
Well, he also used to snort, and there were plenty of people who thought he was snorting Adderall before he went on because he couldn't focus on reading. I wonder what your thought is.
I have no Adderall thoughts. I noticed that he was breathing heavily, but I can't begin to speculate as to why.
So you're not inside Dr. Ronnie Jackson's head,
or whomever, or if there is one. I try to stick to what I know.
Okay, so what is the greatest mystery that remains for you of the Trump administration?
Why did he take more than 300 individualized classified documents to Mar-a-Lago?
Really?
Yes.
Okay, would number two be, why was there no bimbo eruption, to borrow a phrase from the Clinton administration?
We spent a lot of time covering Stormy Daniels. I feel like we dealt with that.
But there was nothing while he
You
was
mean
in
nothing
the White
contemporary?
House. Once he was in office.
I haven't honestly given it that much thought, but considering that he is somebody who spent so much time, the reason that things happened with Bill Clinton and became a question mark, this is actually very similar to a Bill Maher rant from a couple of days ago. Your question is, but the reason that we knew about Bill Clinton was that there were investigations and Bill Clinton lied under oath, and there were women coming forward and accusing him. There was no one who came forward and said anything during the White House years. I don't know. I don't have information to the contrary.
Right.
And frankly, there was so much else happening in that White House that his personal life feels like it was not a huge deal.
Do you have a separate cell phone devoted to calls from Trump?
No.
Do you have a separate ringtone?
No.
Does he ever call you?
I haven't talked to Donald Trump since I interviewed him in September 2021, and he's been extremely angry at various aspects of the book, including beginning with reporting from February 2022 that he had been flushing documents down the toilet in the White House.
Oh, well,
Did I just give you an answer you've never heard before?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I trust you think that's might be the least of it.
Of what? Of what he was getting rid of?
Well,
or what?
okay, here's a question that's so obvious, and I haven't seen any stories about it. Why haven't there been subpoenas for his other properties? I mean, what makes
No, that's a very good question. And it's all a piece of how he was handling documents. I think that's right. My understanding is that there is no recent probable cause for executing a search warrant. Now, maybe that's changed, but that was my last information. They can't just issue it because of a suspicion.
No,
there
of
has
course
to be a
not.
reason. They had probable cause at Mar-a-Lago, which was the videotape of the security footage. They had witness testimony, and they had a signed statement from his lawyer saying, yes, we've returned all the classified material that you were seeking with this subpoena. And so that was the probable cause. They don't have it right now.
Now, I hesitate to ask this question right now because it could devour the rest of the hour. Could you please explain Donald Trump's relationship with Rudy Giuliani?
No, that's a great question. And many have tried. They weren't. So Andrew Kurtzman, formerly of New York One, just wrote a second Giuliani biography. It's very good, and I would recommend that people read it. That attempts to get at that question more than I do. I do address their relationship. They have a very transactional relationship. They were not friends. This whole line that they were pals going back to New York, and Giuliani was a prosecutor, and Trump was in a habit of trying to cultivate prosecutors for obvious reasons, and to cultivate politicians. And so in 1988, and Wayne Barrett wrote about this extensively, in 1988, Giuliani's office got a tip about potential money laundering at Trump Tower. They looked into it, dropped it fairly quickly. There's been claims that there might have been other reasons, which is that Giuliani wanted to have Trump as a fundraiser when Giuliani was about to be mayor. And this basically set the tone, I think, for this relationship.
Well, from my view, it seems that Trump has two really outstanding talents: the ability to compromise and corrupt people, and to get media coverage. If we stick on number one, compromise and corrupt, how do you think he got to Giuliani?
Is your question is, I think, based on the idea that Giuliani was...
My question is based on the old Chicago politics premise that Giuliani is a good politician, he stays bought.
Well, but then I guess you've answered your own question.
No, but I asked you, how did he do it?
Well, I mean, they, again, I think they had a very transactional relationship, and I think that Giuliani wanted to be mayor, and Trump was a developer, and at the time, a real political donor in New York City and in New York State, and I think that was the beginning of that relationship, and it stayed that way.
How has Trump over the years tried to compromise and discredit you?
I knew that was going to be the next question. So I'll answer that in two ways. Discredit, I mean, you can see what he calls me, maggot, in statements. I don't think that is what it is. But that's not, this is somebody who also, he broadly discredits the press. I mean, he refers to us all as the enemy of the people. One of my fondest memories of covering that White House was sitting in the Oval Office with my colleague Peter Baker and our publisher A.G. Sulzberger, sitting across the Resolute desk from Trump, saying directly to Trump, your language about enemy of the people is, enabling despots around the globe to engage in free press crackdowns. And Trump just kept responding, saying, I think I'm entitled to a good story from my paper. And, this was captured in an episode of The Daily, the Times podcast, in February of 2019, and I would really urge people to listen to it, because it's the deepest window, not just into how Trump sees the press, but also how he views the Times, which is what his thing with me is about. It's not, he is uniquely obsessed with the paper. And I'm just the person who covers him more often than others.
Well, that's very modest of you.
It is the truth.
No, it's right about the Times, but it underplays your skill.
I appreciate that, but if I was writing a Substack, I don't think this would be as.
Well, I don't know. Have you listened to Woodward's tapes yet?
I have not. I've listened to snippets of them. I have not had a chance to listen to the whole book.
My guess is you've probably heard almost all of it.
I mean, Trump has a couple of speeds, right? And like it's he gets into salesman mode. He pretends that he's engaging in some secret with you. That's always, to your question about the corrupting thing, that's often what he does. And so I do know that with Woodward, he did a thing where he gave him some of the Kim Jong-un correspondence, which is just so central in so much of the Trump presidency and post-presidency. And he talked about them again last night during his speech, which was kind of incredible given the investigation. But he gave him, according to Bob, copies of and you can hear him on the tape saying this, that he, you didn't get it from me. And this is a big thing with him. I mean, his whole, but it's because one of the things that I think gets missed about Trump, and I just said this, that he has only a handful of moves. Everything is flat and the same and devoid of context. Describing Meade Esposito as ruling with an iron fist, it's the same language that he uses to describe Xi Jinping. Everything is the same. And it just, the context doesn't matter. Donald Trump is the same in every single context. And so, a letter from a notorious dictator written to a sitting president is the same as trading with Page Six, to get them not to write a story about making Marla Maples return 2 gold Lexuses and instead giving them the fact that he was divorcing her, which is also in the book if you want to read about it. That's, I think, the part that really gets missed about him. And yes, those tapes do show that.
What do you think the smartest thing Donald Trump ever said to you is?
That's a really good question. Ask me another one and I'll think.
What's the most perceptive thing Donald Trump ever said to you?
The most perceptive, you said?
Okay, we can come back to that.
Come back to that. It's not that they don't exist. I actually think that what he's very perceptive about is the darkness in human behavior. And so I was just trying to think about whether there was anything that he has said to me that.
Okay, well let's go on to that. And you feel free to say whatever. Do you think Donald Trump understood the just below the surface racism of many Americans as he campaigned?
Yes, I do.
Better than other people?
I think he was more willing to capitalize on it than other people.
And where do you think that goes in the next 2 years?
Nowhere good. I mean, his advisor, he has normalized so much behavior that had been relegated to the fringes of our politics over the course of decades after the Civil Rights era and after the 1970s and 80s. And he is just sort of frozen in time in 1980s New York City. And I write about in the book that the only 2 politicians I ever heard publicly use the phrase "the blacks" was Donald Trump and Andrew Cuomo. And he has a certain mindset. He is openly race baiting Mitch McConnell's wife, who was born in Taiwan. He described Governor Glenn Youngkin's name as sounding Chinese on his social media website the other day. I mean, it's not going to a good place. And to that end, just to close that thought, his chief policy advisor, Stephen Miller, has been just making increasingly overtly racist appeals, both on Twitter and with this political group that he runs, so much so that we got one of his mailers at our house in Brooklyn, which was pretty striking. And it was all about, anti-white and anti-Asian bias. And there will be more of that.
Well, I agree. I mean, in my view, he's not changed a whit. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, he is exactly the same as he was. He's never been capable of telling you the correct time of day. And he's just gotten infinitely more dangerous.
Well, the stakes have become higher, and he has what I would say, and your piece in the Silurians publication was really, I think, important for people to read because it just speaks to how little he's changed. But what he now has that he didn't have before is he has something real that he can point to. I mean, before the real things were, look, I built Trump Tower. So one of the things that was very hard for people around the country when you would try having a discussion with them about he's not actually as rich as he says he is, well, he's richer than 99% of the country. And so most people hear that as, Mike Bloomberg did a whole thing at, I forget which convention it was, but I think it might have been the 2016 one, making fun of Trump as not a real billionaire. And much of the country just hears that as, ugh, they don't hear it as, oh, look, he's not real, because they can see Trump Tower, because they watched The Apprentice and they thought it was real. Now he has been president. That's pretty real. And so I don't think that he has a different foundation that he can point to. It has just fundamentally changed.
Have you ever asked Trump some variation of this question? How do you fleece the suckers?
It's a good question. No, I have not asked that question. I'm not sure I'll get the opportunity, but I'll bear it in mind.
You could do it in a general way and say, how did you get so many people into the casino?
It's a really good question. It is not one that I've asked. I mean, what I imagine he would answer is, they all want a piece of Trump, or we offer the best, or I have that's generally how he sells himself.
Okay, so my view of the Times coverage before the 2016 election is twofold. This is based on having spent a year in Arkansas investigating the Clintons for ABC, that you overplayed the Clintons. I know you're not speaking for the paper.
I'm happy to answer that question.
I know, and that the Times completely missed Trump's grasp of celebrity and how ordinary voters, many of them in so-called red states, wanted a celebrity to touch who they felt they knew.
I don't think that is why Trump won the presidency. I think that voters in red states who voted for Donald Trump wanted a quote-unquote fighter, and they wanted somebody who was voicing a level of anger that a lot of them had in their lives, and Donald Trump came into political being during an enormous era of mistrust in this country, and he fueled it and he capitalized on it. In terms of the Clintons, I know there's a lot of debate about the email coverage. I am not here to answer that, but I am here to say she was under federal investigation, and that's not something.
I'm thinking more of the foundation, actually.
I don't
Steve
think
Bannon bragging after the fact about how he managed to infect the mainstream media with the Peter Schweitzer book.
I think that Steve Bannon has been bragging about infecting all kinds of things for a very long time, number one. But number two, I think that the paper's coverage of Donald Trump made pretty clear who Donald Trump was, where I wish that we all, across the board in the media, had done more of was his business ties and conflicts. And I think that remained an underexplored area, and I think that was problematic. And I think that, we broke a story 2 days ago that on the eve of his next presidential campaign, he was inking a deal with a Saudi real estate firm to develop a golf course in Oman. And so I think that's where our resources should be and will be.
Okay, so this is a simple question, and I think I know where you're going to go, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Fun.
Which is more important to Trump, fame or money?
No, that's a great question.
Or are they inseparable?
They're inseparable. Yeah, they're inseparable.
Sorry, I shouldn't ask you.
That's okay. You're right. They're inseparable. I mean, I think I would put it this way. I think fame is actually more important for him, and here's what, which does not mean that it's hard to overstate how much money matters to him. One of my favorite things that we wrote about in the book is my colleague who I was working with it on, and I was that he was cashing these checks of like these infinitesimal amounts that Spy Magazine was sending him, like 13 cents or something. But he, I think this gets lost a lot in terms of, I think, people understanding sort of why he is how he is. He is a child of privilege who always had money and who always believed there was going to be a net there for him, no matter what happened. And What he didn't have was fame. His father couldn't give him fame. His father could give him connections. His father could give him loans. His father could co-sign, agreements with banks and with landholders. But fame was something totally different.
Okay, let's go to fame and what it means when Ivanka Trump crops Kimberly Guilfoyle out of the wedding picture.
I'm not even going to touch that family dynamic. That's got nothing to do with me.
Well, Ivanka didn't show up last night.
No, she put out a statement and gave an interview to Fox News' website that she doesn't want to be, she's not going to be involved this time. But her husband was there. Her husband was at the announcement. And her husband was the person who was the de facto, Karl Rove, basically, of the campaign in 2020. So
And Don Jr. was off killing mammals, right?
I think he was on a trip and didn't make it back, yes.
Now, there was a dialogue during the, or press coverage, I should say, during the 2016 election that the really rich guys didn't like Trump. The Koch brothers, blah, blah, blah. I didn't believe that for a minute because the Koch brothers, to me, and all the other libertarians, say pick a name out of a hat, Elon Musk, believe in destroying the trust in government. And I cannot think of a more effective candidate than Donald Trump for that role. What's your take on that?
I think I probably have a slightly different frame, but my frame is that the vast majority of rich people and the vast majority of elected officials in this country are pretty, who at least who engage in politics, are pretty transactional. And Donald Trump realized that, and I think that the Koch brothers thought that they were getting something out of it. Although I don't even know that Koch brothers is a bit of a misnomer because things had changed with them, and how that family dynamic was taking place with donors. One brother died. There was, I think there was some family fight. I don't remember the specifics, but I think that's a little bit of a broad brush. But in general, speaking for the donor class, I think that, a lot of people wanted tax cuts, and Trump delivered that, right?
He certainly did. Do you think Mitch McConnell regrets not getting a conviction for impeachment after January 6th?
I think I think that depends on what the outcome is of the leadership vote that's taking place today for the Senate leadership. Okay. But by how many? 37 to 10. Well, that's a lot more than you would have thought against Mitch McConnell, and it's the first time that he's been challenged. I don't know that he's going to be running for another term, but I think that I don't think McConnell regrets it because I think he thinks it would have torn his party apart.
Or it would have moved it forward.
I don't think he thinks it would have moved it forward.
So Marco Rubio was a big critic of Donald Trump. A lot of these other guys were too. And there was a little noticed story in the New York Observer, then owned by Jared Kushner, about Marco Rubio's peccadillos, his alleged affairs, his financials, and it disappeared. But Marco Rubio also disappeared with it and became an ally. I'm wondering what your take is on Donald Trump's access to National Enquirer files.
It's beyond the scope of what I know. I have no idea whether he obviously had a relationship with David Pecker that's been pretty well established. David Pecker, who ran the parent company of National Enquirer. We have written extensively at the paper and the Wall Street Journal broke a lot of stories about the connections between Trump and Pecker. I have a scene in the book related to this, but I just can't speak. Yeah,
I know you do. That's what made me think of it. And the other thing that made me think of it was the recent threats about revealing dirt on DeSantis, and it made me wonder whether Trump had been efficient enough to get the DeSantis file from the National Enquirer.
Or maybe one doesn't exist and Trump is just making it up, the same way that Trump made up that he had sent in the DOJ to Florida in the 2018 election. I mean, this is the problem, is that he says things that are not true all the time, and whether they are true or not true, he says the same thing, and that's very disorienting to people.
Which leads me to one of the most important questions to you, I guess. How do you know when Trump is telling you the truth?
That is the fundamental question, and so I'll answer it this way. There was something that I was trying to confirm, and that we wanted to be sure he had said on something, and he had confirmed it to someone, and I went to a former White House official and I said, I'm trying to confirm XYZ, and they said, didn't he confirm it? And I said, that's an iffy source. I don't. It's, you can't assume that he's, So, and I'll give you another example. And this was interesting. So, in April of 2016, or maybe it was March. It was one of those months. My then colleague Alex Burns got a tip that Paul Manafort was being hired by the Trump campaign to crunch delegates at the convention, because there was that effort to try to stop him, which I would really remind everyone to read up on, that there's no mechanism for the party to stop him if he wins a bunch of primaries. There is, but that's a contested convention and the brokered convention, and those are very unlikely and exist in political reporter fantasia. But his aides weren't answering me because they were hoping that it wouldn't happen, because there was this dynamic where Manafort was on one side and other aides were on the other. So I called Trump's cell, and he answered, and he was railing about some headline he was upset about. So it was like 10 minutes of him just talking. And then I finally got my question in, and he said, yes, it's true. He said, you can say that Mr. Trump said, yes, it is true, or you can say Mr. Trump said, yes, it's true. Okay. But even then, I still was like, he's on the record, and we're running this story, and I still don't feel 100%. So, it's, that said, he was about to become the party nominee, and we can't not interview him or talk to him.
Can you explain his belief in people like Mike Flynn?
One of the scenes in the book is when Flynn was enmeshed, but before he had been dismissed as National Security Advisor, a job that he held for a very short amount of time. Trump had already soured on him. He started souring on him during the transition for a variety of reasons, including that his son was tweeting conspiracy theories about, the John Podesta leaked emails. And so by then there were all these reports, particularly David Ignatius in the Post, about Flynn's conversation with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, and what may or may not have taken place. And Trump is at Mar-a-Lago, and he's walking by the bar area, and two of his aides are sitting at the bar. The club is not open yet. It's a Sunday morning, and Flynn's face, his picture is shown on one of the Sunday shows, and Trump looks up and says, a lot of problems with that guy. I think he's going to make it, as if he was, just sort of a bystander. And he, which is often how he approached these things, he doesn't like people who give him bad headlines, and he does like people who fight for him, and he has a huge willingness to give in to the idea of a hidden hand controlling everything, and Flynn speaks to that. So I think that's really the answer.
When Trump took office, I had this fantasy that his first official act, and this is a fantasy, this is not reported anywhere, that his first official act, this is just what I know about his character, his first official act was to get the CIA, the National Intelligence Group, to give him the portfolio on how much Putin was really worth, because he wanted to find out how he did it.
Are you asking me to comment on?
No, I'm asking you, what is his fascination with Putin?
That's another unanswered question. He clearly has it. He said to me in one of my interviews with him, he has said to others, I liked Putin and he liked me. I write in the book about how some of Trump's advisors felt physically sick watching him in Helsinki sharing a stage with Putin, taking Putin's side over the director of national intelligence, Dan Coates, about whether Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. Trump had spent decades trying to build in Russia, off and on in sort of halting fashion. He, certainly had Russian money coming into some of his real estate holdings, just in the form of ownership. But whether it's more than that, I have no idea. He likes strongmen. I mean, that's the other thing, is that it's very possible that is the answer.
I think you do a fabulous job of analyzing Trump's, the differences between Trump's ability to strategize versus shrewdness. How he's calculating but not necessarily planful. And I want you to talk about that in a minute, but and his view of violence as power.
One of the things that just comes up with him over and over again in listening to him and reading about him and talking to people about him across the spectrum of his life is that, violence informs his idea of strength, and that in turn informs his idea of what makes a good leader or boss. And I can't think of anyone who has risen to the level of president in modern history in our country who has spoken so admiringly of violence. Part of that is, he speaks about a need to take on others, and then he portrays what's happening around the country as if it's, a violent hellscape that needs to be countered. And that's not really true either, although crime is obviously rising. But that's, been true of him for decades. He spoke in 1990 admiringly about the Tiananmen Square protest crackdown. That was strength. And so it's sort of always just been out there with him. And then, I'm sorry, what was the other question? There was a first one.
We were talking about the way he calculated.
About
versus why he doesn't really actually have any strategy.
Yeah, he's not strategic, but he is calculating moment to moment. It's just often something that's happening in his head where he thinks that he's, gaming you on something. And you can see that, for instance, over and over again in the Mueller report, where, you'll have him asking the staff secretary to go get, some kind of a letter from the White House counsel, and then Trump will tell another aide, he's getting that, or John Kelly denied this, and then John Kelly didn't deny this, and it's very hard to keep track of.
I'm not your editor, but I'd really love to read a story about what happened when you said to Trump, you gave Bob the Kim letters. How about the Putin transcript?
I don't know that there is a transcript.
I know, but I guess my point is, the games he plays, how, as a reporter, do you deal with him?
The way that I dealt with him, and everybody doesn't deal with him the same way. I write about the fact that the press writ large in 2016 nationally was unprepared to deal with somebody who says things that are not true about matters big and small as frequently as he does, and that it really doesn't matter, to your point about the time of day, it doesn't matter what the topic is, he'll just say something. And so that's a challenge for all of us. When it comes to reporting on him, it's vitally important that we contextualize him, and I would argue that, you were talking about what you saw as media failings in 2016. I would argue that I think that the significant criticism can be made of coverage of him by a lot of outlets in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where he was just saying these things about himself that weren't true. But because people had not encountered somebody who would, and as you know, in the news business, we give people the benefit of the doubt. And that is what we are supposed to do to be fair. The problem is that he exploits that and uses it to his advantage too. So the process of covering Donald Trump as a political figure is a process of, I think, constant reflection and re-examination.
My last question, and it's violating my rule of asking one-part questions. Are you going to saddle up for the next 2 years?
My son asked me that last night. One of my sons. I, at the moment, am planning on doing what the paper asks me to do, which is be part of its politics coverage, and that will include Donald Trump, but I will not cover him hour to hour the way that I did for the previous years.
Okay, so my last question, I guess, is
so close to a clean getaway.
That was supposed to be a one-part, two-part, but it was only one part. The way I see the current scene is the Weasel's Picnic. All these guys are trying to stab Donald Trump and not leave a fingerprint. And I'm wondering how you see this playing out.
At the moment, I think that if the election were today, a general election, Donald Trump would lose a general election. But if a primary were held today, Donald Trump would win the primary. And so, no, obviously we don't have a national primary in this country, but I think he is more vulnerable than at any point that I can remember, other than the 2-week period after January 6th, or 3 weeks, whenever it was, and Kevin McCarthy showing up at Mar-a-Lago, seeking a rapprochement with him, but to protect his own caucus and his own future. But I mean, the story of this book is about people writing Donald Trump's obit over and over and over, and he just finds a way to come back. And the things that matter to us in this room, or many of us anyway, do not necessarily matter to the people who cast the votes. And so I would not, he is still really strong. We will know more in the coming days. We will know, how's his fundraising going? Are donors, does he have any major donors left? Can he really get a campaign off the ground? Will he get indicted? I mean, we don't know. But absent that, I would not write him off.
Tony? Okay, we're ready for questions.
We're ready for questions. I have one. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Tony.
I think you said at the beginning that the biggest mystery for you in the aftermath of the Trump administration is why he took 300 confidential and top secret documents with him to Mar-a-Lago. And I also heard you say you like to talk about what you know. But I'm going to ask you, do you have some informed ideas about why he would have done that?
The Washington Post had a story the other day that is what I have been saying for literally months and getting attacked for saying, which is that I think that, he likes trophies. If you have ever been to his office at Trump Tower, which I suspect some of you in this room have, he gives you a tour of, here's Shaquille O'Neal's shoe, and here's this framed thing that Scott Walker sent me, and here's all these front pages of me, and then, to the secretaries, call up the rap videos where my name is getting mentioned. Like, this is what he does. And so, we have reporting on this, the Washington Post has reporting on this, that there's no clear pattern to what he had, which makes it harder to figure out what exactly he planned to do with it. And that goes to a piece of it. Now, he likes trophies, he likes leverage. And I don't know if he saw some leverage in some of this. A lot of what he does is about leverage. The theory that I struggle with is this idea that he was planning some mass sale of the documents. I don't think he has the wherewithal to do that, and I don't think that you could do that quietly, frankly. I just don't see how that doesn't get picked up by intel agencies. In my experience with Donald Trump, he does things because he can, and I think that's it.
In your epilogue, you say that you had 3 one-on-ones with Donald Trump, but your book is so detailed. There's so much going on, and there are so many quotes that you quote. And I'm wondering, how did you get so much information, and how could you stand the language that he's using all the time? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, for some of it, I worked in a bar for several years, and I worked in several newsrooms. Thank you for reading it. I had a really good research assistant, and I had a really good freelance editor, and so we went through reams and reams and reams of old clips, and and then some I was pointed to, like one of my favorites was this one I wasn't pointed to, I found, but he gave this interview to the Washington Times where he described himself as a very honest person in a very corrupt world, and in the mid 1990s when he was trying to map, the notion of a comeback when he had not really come back yet, and then in the interviews with him, and this sort of goes to a question you asked before, and how you deal with him. You can't just let him talk because he will just filibuster. But I'm not doing a television interview. Like, I went to these interviews to get information, and I'm not, trying to pound on the desk and do a Perry Mason moment. There are questions, even with him as a questionable narrator, that only he can answer. So only he could answer, whether Bob Morgenthau would be investigating him if Bob Morgenthau was in office, and his answer was unequivocally no, and that was really interesting. Only he could answer questions about how he viewed Meade Esposito or viewed power. And then he often, when he feels unguarded, he sort of reveals something that he doesn't mean to. And so that was that. And a lot of it was, stuff that wouldn't have made the news report at the Times, but that was stuff that still, I thought, informed a portrait of him. That was all.
Has Rupert Murdoch genuinely pulled the plug on him, or is this just theater and he's still hedging his bets?
I don't think it's theater. I mean, I think he's really, from everything I know in my reporting about how Murdoch sees this, it's that it's very destructive for his party. The problem is that, are any of you Curb Your Enthusiasm fans? All right, so you know the episode of The Survivor, and they're yelling at each other, and then someone knocks some wine over, and the mother-in-law says, "Somebody get a sponge," and Larry says, "Why don't you get a sponge?" That's the entire story of who stops Trump. Somebody get a sponge. Someone must stop him. So, the Murdoch publications had an opportunity to be more aggressive against him for a very long time, and they didn't. I do think it's sincere now, but that doesn't mean there won't be a snapback if he's the nominee. If he's the nominee against Joe Biden, I fully expect that there will be a very lengthy Wall Street Journal editorial about Mr. Trump's crude language, and then on we go. So it's not theater, it's just that I don't know that it holds.
Maggie, I have a two-part question. One very personal, and the other one
Fantastic,
very Trump.
my favorite.
I'll try with the Trump first. Do you think he's really worried about going to prison?
I think he's really worried about getting indicted. I don't think he thinks he's going to prison. I frankly am not sure anyone should think he's actually going to prison, even if he gets indicted.
Very personal. You are the daughter of one of the great journalists of our time.
That's true.
Your mother is a highly respected public relations person.
That's true, too.
Many children want to stay as far away from their parents' professions as they can. What decided you to become a journalist?
Necessity. I couldn't get a job doing anything else. So, that was, I studied fiction writing at Sarah Lawrence, and when I got out, I wanted to work in magazines, and no one would hire me. And so I ended up getting hired as a copy kid at the Post. But I had never had much interest in journalism. That was what my father did. But I really fell in love with the newsroom within a matter of days. And then I fell in love with a colleague, and we got married, and we're both still in the business.
Were you ever threatened by Mr. Trump because of your interest, your research and your writing? That's the first part of the question. And conversely, did he ever hit on you, as he seems to have only a few speeds with how he deals with women?
He has never hit on me. He has never overtly threatened me other than the stuff that you read in public.
There's a hypothesis that Donald Trump learned a lot from his time in wrestling. Could you talk a little bit about that hypothesis, about his moves?
Yeah, I mean, so he wasn't really in wrestling. He was sort of a super fan of wrestling, and he was close friends with Vince McMahon. He's also had Linda McMahon in his administration. It's theater, I mean, it's all part of presenting some fake portrait of strength. And so I don't think that he learned from it so much as he thrived around it. But I agree with you that it's actually an underexplored part of his curriculum vitae.
Given how close the recent congressional elections were, how much of it do you think really is Donald Trump that made it close, the negativity towards him, and how much would it have been that close if Roe v. Wade's decision would have been after the election?
It's a really good question. I think every Democratic strategist I talk to will make very clear that they think, and there are strategists around Trump who do not agree, there are other Republican strategists who do, that the reason that the bottom didn't fall out of Democratic turnout was because of the Dobbs decision. If without the Dobbs decision, this might have looked much more like 2010. Even though 2010 was, I think, 63 seats, it couldn't be that many now just because of redistricting and these gerrymandered districts. But I do think a lot of it was, it's two factors. I think it's that people are rejecting it's not just election denialism, it's that what Trump is talking about and the candidates he endorsed are talking about adds to this sense of instability. And so at a time when people are already feeling unstable because of financial conditions, they had the opposite reaction, which was not, we're going to go to the party out of power. The party out of power looked chaotic. In part, and number two, voters don't, the exit polling showed this, they don't react viscerally to Joe Biden the way they do to Trump. Even the disapproval numbers don't tell the full story. So I think that's a big piece of it.
Hi, my question is, how do you use silence when you're trying to get information from a source? How do you decide between, I'm on the phone with them, they've said something, I'm going to wait until they start talking more to fill the space, versus, oh my God, this is not worth my time, goodbye, and hanging up?
That is literally one of the best journalism questions that you could ask. I'm a reactor, so I constantly have to check myself on this. One of the single best people I have ever seen engage in that way is, and sort of know when to react and when not to, is Mike Schmidt, my colleague, who, I literally feel like sometimes I could light myself on fire on the phone with him, and he would just be like, "Huh," and it's very impressive. But it's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge that every reporter has. I think that. I think you always want to err on the side of letting somebody talk more than not, because you just never know what they're going to say next, and you never know what's going to elicit something. If someone starts becoming abusive, then get off the phone. But that should generally be the line.
How did you get his cell phone number? And how often do you use it? And does he always answer when you call?
Well,
and how many other people have it?
That's many questions. He has a different cell phone number now than he used to, because it changed in the White House. And there's been lots written about his issues with cell phone use, that his staff had to spend a lot of time tamping this down. I write about this in the book. It is a national security issue. It's just that it always seemed like it was a joke, because so much of it ends up seeming sort of, like it's running with a laugh track with him, but it's not funny. Someone gave me his cell phone number. I'm not going to say who, and then someone gave me his new cell phone number. And as I said, I haven't talked to him since my last interview with him.
What's going to be the difference between Elon Musk taking over Twitter and Trump? I mean, tell us what we need to worry about.
Well, one's the president and one's a private company of a website that I think has become increasingly irresponsible. So, I would argue that they both have a thing that they are good at, and you can't really actually necessarily translate that thing to another thing. I mean, Elon Musk is actually an extremely accomplished person, but what's happening with Twitter right now is.
But is he going to reinvigorate Trump?
Oh, you mean by coming back on Twitter? He would let him back on. Trump keeps insisting no. I find it very hard to believe that if Trump has the opportunity to come back to Twitter, he won't.
The newspapers today are full of speculation that one of the reasons he announced so early was that he wanted to block investigations from the Justice Department. Explain that and what we know about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's real. He has made very clear that he thinks the Justice Department, to advisors, that he thinks the Justice Department will not indict him if he is a candidate. He thinks it'll make it harder for them. Now, they have put out word repeatedly that what his political calculations have nothing to do with what we're doing, and I think that in their most optimistic scenario, that's true. It doesn't mean that they will indict him. It just means that it'll be separate. But I think that there has to be an awareness by Merrick Garland that Donald Trump is going to claim that Joe Biden's investigating him for the next, 18 months if it continues. And frankly, and even if it ends, even if nothing happens, he'll then say, "Look what I faced. Look at my ordeal." So it's a really complicated calculation for them, but that is definitely part of his thinking.
Are you surprised that he hasn't been indicted? First by Mueller, and more recently by 4 or 5 other potential prosecutors.
I don't know what evidence they have. Mueller, I was not surprised, because Mueller was never going to indict him, just because of the OLC opinion saying you don't indict a sitting president in the post-Nixon era. I don't know what evidence the Georgia prosecutors have. The January 6th case, my understanding is that they're ways away from trying to charge him and possibly anyone. The documents case represents, to me, the biggest threat to him. There are a lot of people who were surprised he was not indicted by the Manhattan District Attorney, and one of whom was Mark Pomerantz, who was the prosecutor looking into it. I think that prosecuting a former president in this country is a bridge that hasn't been crossed yet, and I'm not sure that anybody wants to do that lightly. So, to that extent, I'm not surprised.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So for this crowd, you're our Taylor Swift, the #1 rock star, and I want to urge everybody to buy your book. Right over there. Thank you again. That was great.